Hi, welcome everyone. Today we're talking to Dr. Jarrod Bailey. He's the Director of Science and Technology for the Center for Contemporary Sciences and a Fellow of the Oxford Center for Animal Ethics. You're basically an animal ethics expert. Welcome.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for asking.
To start off, this is something for me that is a whole new world, but animals being used in for medicines or drug testing. A lot of people think it's a necessary evil, but tell me if it is or not.
It's an understandable question, an understandable statement. I used to think it was a necessary evil too, but as I progressed through my scientific career as a researcher, I started to question the scientific necessity of using animals, whether it was helpful or not, necessary, whether doing something on a rat or a mouse or a dog or a monkey could actually be reliably predictive for humans. And the more I looked and the more I found out, the more I realized that wasn't the case. It really wasn't the case. So, we can look at some big areas of failure. More than 90% of drugs, new drugs that look safe and effective in animal testing, then go on to fail in human clinical trials. And even many of those that get through and get marketed then go on to have warnings placed on them because of adverse effects or are withdrawn from the market, again, because of safety issues not seen in animal testing. Other areas of failure in research where we're just not managing to get to the bottom of diseases and what causes them and what we can do to treat or cure them. We have HIV/AIDS vaccines, hepatitis C, and vaccines and treatments for that, understanding and treatment and treating Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's disease, strokes, motor neuron disease, all sorts of cancers. We have to know that cancer is one of the biggest areas of failure for new drugs. Sepsis, blood infection, which is one of the biggest killers of people globally, and many, many more. We're just not learning what these diseases are about, how they work, and even what we can target for new treatments and cures for them. And the reason we can't is because one species is just far, far too different biologically from another to be able to take data from experiments and research involving that species, whether it's, as I've said, dogs, monkeys, rats, mice, and apply it to another. So the first thing we have to appreciate is the increasing evidence of the failure of animal experiments to inform human biology. And secondly, that there are better things we can do in science to do what we need to do to find out what we need to find out. And we can talk about a few of those things maybe a little bit later in the interview.
And just for us to understand, so if someone has, let's keep it to the coronavirus, someone has a cure, a vaccine. It's a global procedure that first you have to test it on an animal. That's mandatory, right? You have to test it on an animal first.
Yes, that's the way what's called regulatory agencies work. To market a new drug or a vaccine, you have to clear it through the regulatory agencies in your country. And what they demand is animal data. It's not legal. It's not a law that you have to do animal experiments, but it might as well be law because that's what the regulators want to see.
And what happens?
So no, I was just going to say that it's so we have to perceive a difference between what the regulatory agencies want to see to approve a new drug and whether something is scientifically justifiable and necessary. Those two things are very, very different.
Because what I understand from you also is that when you test something on an animal, because the genetics, the biology of an animal is so different from us humans that sometimes if it doesn't work on an animal, it could work on a human, but it doesn't even get tested on a human.
That's exactly true. So I was involved in some work. I've published 4 papers on it in the last 7 years, I think. So when we set out to do this work, trying to find out whether animal testing of new drugs could predict human safety or human toxicology, we were surprised that animal testing using millions of animals over the years had gone on for 40, 50, 60 years. And yet there was nothing published that proved those animal tests were scientifically justifiable, that they were predictive. So we set out to do our own work. There were some data that were publicly available that had been published, and we used all of that. I think it was on more than 2,300 drugs that had data in animals and data in humans. And our main finding was that when something looks to be safe or free from toxic effects in animals, it tells you next to nothing at all about how likely that drug is to be safe in humans too. It's what's called evidential weight. Those animal data are providing no evidential weight towards the likelihood of the drug being safe in humans. And that's a big finding, because what you're looking for is a suggestion of safety, a freedom from toxic and adverse effects. And we were finding that the animal data really added nothing at all. The problem is that's largely been ignored by by the people who are developing the drugs, by the people who are requiring the animal tests, because it's an inconvenient truth. It's what they basically set their industry on, set their reputation on, got their legal protection from for an awful long time. So we said a couple of things. Firstly, there's no scientific justification to do this. And secondly, there is better science that you can do to predict the likelihood of human safety or the likelihood of toxic events. So getting back onto very briefly to your original point, yes, it's accepted across the board, right through the industry and science, that we will have lost drugs that would have been safe and effective in humans because they looked harmful in animal tests. And there are examples of this. One is a drug called Gleevec for leukemia. And it was very toxic in a lot of the animal tests. It was really toxic to dogs. It caused liver damage. And it was almost stopped from development until somebody looked at the effects, at the results from human cultured cells in a test tube in the lab, where it looked good and it looked like it wasn't causing any nasty effects to the cells. So it was pulled out, in it went to human trials, and it's become a successful drug. And we also know, for example, that aspirin, a simple pain-killing drug like aspirin, wouldn't be approved now because it would fail in animal tests because it's toxic to animals like cats and dogs. So we have undoubtedly also lost good drugs because of animal testing. That's a fact.
And with all the research you've done and with all the data available now saying that animals just don't have our genes or our biology, and we should find different ways, why is it not? Because we have a guest writer, Catherine Kelly, she's written topics about this for the Animal Reader, and because of her, I learned that there's a lot of data available saying that animals just don't look like humans, and that it's basically, to say it in a really simple way, like it's not even a waste of time, but you're killing animals, you're hurting animals for almost absolutely nothing, actually. But why is it still done? Why don't people listen to your research or read up, or scientists say, okay, we're going to skip the animal trials?
It's a brilliant question, and I think it's one of human nature, not just in science, but in human nature. People are creatures of habit. People don't want to be wrong. People have pride in what they've built their careers on. People earn their money and pay their mortgage and their bills based on the job they do, and quite often, unless it really obviously is going to benefit them, people are resistant to change. So this has been, animal testing, animal research has been the thing to do in biomedical science for so long. It's going to be a hard fight to get out of it. What I think is encouraging is the number of scientists who are now switching onto this and who are now appreciating that there are better ways to do science. Humane science is better science, is human relevant science. And also appreciating one very important thing, again, which some of my work has looked at as a geneticist. My background is in genetics. We often hear that animal experiments have to be relevant to humans because we're actually quite genetically similar. It's often said we're about 99% similar to chimpanzees, 97 or 6% similar to monkeys. Now that's true on a very superficial level, but less true the more you look into it and with a more critical eye. But what is the major point is that the genes one species have and one doesn't, even though it's just a few percent, are very powerful, very important genes that are known to be involved in many diseases like neurodegenerative diseases, Alzheimer's, Parkinson's, the function of the immune system, cancer, and so on. But even more importantly, even if we share perhaps 90, 92, 93% of our genes, about a quarter to a third of those genes, thousands of the genes that we do share, are expressed differently. And that really matters. Those genes are doing a very different job, even though they're similar or the same gene. And that matters. And again, those gene expression differences have been linked to all sorts of biological functions, to all sorts of diseases. And it means that not only do we have to accept that animal models are bad models for humans, we have to accept that animal models can never be good, reliable models for humans because of these genetic differences. We really have to move on. We really have to, as a matter of urgency, embrace some of the amazing human-specific technologies that science has now made available to research. And the sooner we do that, not only the sooner we're not causing suffering to 200 million animals a year in laboratories around the world, the sooner we're actually tackling human suffering, because we are going to know why people are getting diseases, how those diseases are causing suffering to people, and we're going to flag up how we can treat and cure those diseases. We have to do it as soon as possible, because everyone's a winner when we do that.
Yeah, and that is exactly, I think people don't understand. It's something for me, I also had to read up on this a lot to understand this, is that like testing on animals is not only harming those animals, but also humans, because there might be drugs that could be good for us we don't get to test. Plus, if it's successful in an animal, it could still be harmful for us. I think there was even, I think Catherine wrote about that. There was a research in the States where it was approved on monkeys, I think, and when it was tested on people, 5 of them died instantly because they got only a small amount. So it's like, people really have to understand that testing on animals, it's not only for the animals, it would be better not to do that, but also for humans.
That's absolutely right. I mean, if you think about the billions of dollars, euro, pounds that have been spent on biomedical research over the years, and how little progress we've made in so many diseases. I mean, it's the big ones I've already mentioned. We still don't have an AIDS vaccine after more than 30 years of work, and hundreds of vaccines that have worked in animals and failed in clinical trials. We still don't have really effective drugs for stroke, despite hundreds again that have looked good in animals, and so on and so on and so on. We still don't know really the basis of Alzheimer's and Parkinson's. And the reason is because we're using the wrong models. So, for example, humans get Parkinson's disease, and we know some pathology that we can associate with Parkinson's disease. The main model we use in Parkinson's disease is a monkey where you've injected a poison into the monkey's brain that gives the monkey Parkinson's-like symptoms, movement disorders. It isn't Parkinson's disease. And on the one hand, science is doing some very clever things with these monkey models. But on the other, I think it's fair to say science is being very stupid on the whole, because they persist in using a monkey model that is so superficially and poorly relevant to human Parkinson's disease. We're never going to get anywhere with it. And by the way, this is true. One thing that's been done to try and make animal models less poor or more human relevant has been to genetically modify them, to make so-called GM animals, to knock out genes in animals, to put genes into animals, to tweak them, to try and recreate mutations that we've associated with disease in humans, and see if we can make a good model. And it just doesn't work. Again, we have failures right across the board, so many diseases and conditions, such a poor level of translation from those GM animals to humans. And it really astounds me that science is still so resistant in the face of all the evidence about the poor human relevance of animal models. And let's get back onto the main topic here. What we can do instead. We can do amazing things in clinical research with human volunteers and with patients, with scanning machines, with genomic and proteomic analysis of what's going on in our own cells and tissues and organs. We can grow 3-dimensional cultures of all different types of human cells in the lab. Mini organs called organoids, actual mini human organs. We have techniques like organ on a chip, body on a chip, where something the size of your phone can contain 6, 7, maybe more now, different types of mini human organs with circulatory systems, and you can really work out what's going on. And it might not be a human body, it might not be 100% effective, but it's human specific. So it's much, much, much better than taking data from something you've injected into a rat or a dog or a monkey and wondering whether that applies to people or not, because much, much more often than not, it doesn't. I think the evidence is clear. We have to move on. We have to do better science. We can do better science, and let's do it sooner rather than later.
And that's also because you just mentioned for HIV, there's still not a cure for that, and it's been, I think you said 20 years now, 30?
It's been over 30 years. I look back in 2008. I was involved in some research to support a project to end research on chimpanzees, and it only really took place in America. Lots of chimpanzees had been imported and bred in America because it was known that you can infect chimpanzees with HIV. They're the only other species you can infect with HIV. Yeah. The problem is that when you infect a chimp with HIV, they don't get AIDS. So something very, very different is going on with the virus, the infection, the pathology, and so on and so forth. And that's what made the chimpanzee, ultimately, it was acknowledged it was a poor model for human AIDS. But the point is that my own paper suggested that there was almost 100 different HIV/AIDS vaccines, many of which had been tested in chimpanzees, and in about 200 human trials, none of them worked. I updated the figures recently and found out that there seem to now have been about 750 human trials of AIDS vaccines. Not only, again, have none of them worked in humans, some of them even appear to have made humans more susceptible to HIV infection. It's a complete catastrophe. It's a dereliction of duty of science to persist with using monkeys. And by the way, so there are better things we can do. We can grow entire human immune systems and of different people to bring in variability between humans. We can do that all in the lab and work out whether a new vaccine is likely to be safe and effective. By the way, just to finish my point, the campaign against chimpanzee research, despite the insistence of the chimpanzee researchers and the institutes that made a lot of money from that chimpanzee research, despite the insistence that science would go nowhere without using chimpanzees because they were so similar to humans and we had to use them. In 2011, the Institute of Medicine did an inquiry and agreed with us that chimpanzee research wasn't necessary. And the NIH, the funding body in America, stopped funding chimpanzee research, largely because we had proven with our scientific research and papers, we had proven our point. We didn't need to do it.
And that's great. And let's hope, like with what you're doing now, you can like stop animal testing all over. But is it to take it more like to 2020, like COVID-19, will the same thing happen? Because we just first started in the beginning, I think people were skipping animal trials for a second. That made me really happy to read. They were going instantly to humans, but then that has kind of like gone back to we need to test on animals. And then there was, it's such a weird sentence to read. There was a lot of people were ordering animals all over, like trying to get as many animals. And then they had to figure out which animal, if you give it COVID-19, which animal gets the same symptoms as. So it's a whole, will the same thing happen, like you said, with HIV, that in 30 years we'll still won't have a vaccine?
I really, really hope not. I think, there seems to be a greater urgency for COVID because it's a global pandemic, and because it's easily transmissible. It's transmissible through people's breath and touch. Yeah. So the urgency to do something is really there. It was very encouraging at first. Scientists who see the issues with animal research have been saying all along, You don't need to do this. It's not necessary. It's not predictive. So the urgency translated into a rush into very carefully regulated human clinical trials, largely based on results from similar vaccines, similar viruses in the past. It was thought, look, we kind of know that this is safe enough, that this is not a huge risk. The problem goes back to what I mentioned earlier, which is the difference between the regulators requiring something for their own peace of mind, because they've always done it, because that's what they're comfortable with, for legal protection if anything goes wrong. And the difference between that and a scientific requirement, a scientific necessity to do some experiments on animals because they help protect humans. And that's what we've seen. It's the vaccine developers have gone back to ticking the animal test box so that the regulators, if their vaccine looks good in humans, so that the regulators can approve it more quickly. And the problem is, to get onto your second point, which is why researchers who want to research COVID-19, it's habit. It's almost automatic without thinking. We need an animal model. We need an animal model to do this. They tried to infect mice. It didn't really work. They tried to infect mice, a transgenic, genetically modified mouse from years ago that had been made for something else. And they thought that would be great because it has the receptor that the virus uses to infect people. And it worked better, but still not very well. So now scientists are scratching around, for want of a better phrase, to try and find the least bad animal model that they might be able to use to research COVID-19. And what they should be doing is starting not with an animal model, but starting with the human being, maintaining their focus on the human situation, the human immune system, the actual virus itself, and how it infects people, and how it causes its pathology and its disease, and what can be done to do it. Because we can do that with a human focus, and we're wasting our time doing anything else.
Exactly, because then the vaccines that are not making it through those animal testings could actually work on us. So there could be a vaccine that is like good for us, but we don't know about it because they don't get through the animal tests.
It's certainly possible, and yeah, because of the way things are done, we could never know if something has been discarded because of poor results in animal tests that actually could have gone through and been successful in humans, and that's the real dilemma. There's an unknown there, but scientifically it's probable that could happen. Absolutely.
We have a question from Thomas. He says, do you think many of these research groups try to make the model seem viable just to get the funding?
It's very easy to sound cynical answering that, but I'm a scientist. I've been a scientist in academic research. I've had to write grants and get funding, justify that funding with papers, and to enable me to get another grant to have more research funded. This is how science works. Whether you're doing animal research or not, that's how science works. So I think, again, to go back, not to play a blame game, but just to look at human nature, where we're comfortable with what we know, with what we do, with what we've always done. And that's how science works. You almost get some blinkers and you work on, if not your disease or your gene or your protein, you work on your narrow area of work, and that's what you do. If you're used to using animal models, you will continue to use animal models pretty much. And I think that's a cycle that a lot of scientists need to try and break out of. And what we're trying to do at the Center for Contemporary Sciences that's just been set up, and we're just trying to work out how we're going to achieve what we want to achieve. What we're trying to do is to facilitate that, is to educate scientists at all stages of their career, right from high school up to postdoctoral scientists, professorships, and so on. That there is a path to doing better science, to doing the best science, and that has to involve, from the evidence we see, that has to involve leaving animal research behind, if that's where you've been, and embracing and looking into and developing and using human-specific research methods like some of the ones I mentioned. So what we're hoping to do is to make it easier for scientists and for science as a whole to make that move to do research that's not just more humane and doesn't use animals, but that is better for people as well, more human relevant, and will be more successful.
And do you see change coming in that? Do you see maybe a younger generation that says we don't want to test on animals, we've read the data, we want to try more models that look more like humans? Or you have also something called zero, that you give a very small amount to a human. That's also where you could test
microdosing, where
microdosing.
I mean, microdosing is one of those techniques that can work alongside all of the others and tell us all we need to know about a new drug, without any need to scratch our heads and wonder if our rat data is relevant to humans or not. So there's a whole plethora of methods we can use. And to answer your question about whether there's a new generation coming through, yes, I really think so. That's not to say that there aren't older scientists who are committed to and who believe in human-specific research. But there's certainly a new generation of scientists coming through, some of who will fall into animal research and probably do it and want to continue it and even defend it. But from my own experience and the experience of a lot of scientists I know, a lot of people who I work with, we know that a lot of younger people are astounded by the fact that we still test things in animals and still try and fool ourselves that is relevant to human safety, human protection, human benefit at all. They see the need, the scientific need, to keep that focus on human biology, and that's what we need to do. And I think that's a great hope, and that is what will catalyze the paradigm shift, if you like, away from using animals and to maintain our focus on human biology from the very start, because that's how we'll see success, and that's how we'll benefit people, patients, and people with loved ones who are suffering from diseases and who need cures and treatments. That's how it's going to change. That's how it's going to work.
Yeah, and I hope it will, because at the moment, you just mentioned it already, there's 200 million animals being used at the moment in research. And which are the biggest countries that do tests on animals, the biggest centers?
Yeah, it's, animal research, the numbers were going down in the late 70s and the 1980s. I think arguably because people were realizing that animal research wasn't really working. It really failed in a lot of areas. Yeah. It really wasn't human relevant. And then along came genetic modification, and everyone, a lot of scientists jumped on that, went about making GM animals thinking they would be the answer. And unfortunately, we're still on the upward curve there, which is a shame. So that's what's responsible for the increase in animal use. The numbers, they've almost doubled in between 2005 and 2015 globally. A former colleague of mine, Katie Taylor at Cruelty Free International, did a lot of this work. That includes animals used for breeding, the supply of tissues, animals who weren't used in experiments but who were killed because they were surplus to requirements. It's a lot of animals. But in terms of the animals actually used in proper research, if you like, those numbers globally went up from 60 million roughly in 2005 to 80 million. So we're talking about huge numbers of animals. Yeah. And somewhere I've got the figures for it. It's not just rats and mice. Currently, over 200,000 dogs every year are used in research around the world. Over 160,000 monkeys are used in research every year around the world. These are shocking numbers, and it really seems on some level like a lot of scientists really aren't learning their lesson and just can't see past using animals, despite all of the evidence that tells them they should. Yeah. In terms of countries, I believe China, unfortunately, the increase in China has been immense. I mean, I think 500 or 600% in that time period. So I believe China is the biggest now. America is still one of the very biggest, maybe second or third. In Europe, you have, I think it's still the UK, Germany, and France are the biggest users of animals. So for all, what's changed in my time period since I left academic research 15 years ago and started working for this to shine a light on animal research and whether it's any good or not and whether there's better science we can do. What's happened in that 15 years is huge interest and a huge commitment to moving away from animal research. And this is even from within the industry itself, the people who do the animal research, the people who do the animal testing. There is a commitment politically, certainly in the EU, to try and move away from it as quickly as possible. So that's changed. So that gives me a lot of hope. And by the way, I think that's particularly true in the Netherlands. I was at a conference in Utrecht at the end of last year, where the Dutch government wants to do this. They see the scientific need to do this, and they're really proactive in trying to bring people together to achieve this shift in focus. And they should be commended for that. So there is a lot of hope around. Yeah. And as I say, it's not just hope for the animals in labs and all the millions of them. It's hope for all of us, for human beings who need to understand disease and to get effective, safe cures and treatments for them, because we're not going to do that through using animals. We need to change tack, and I think there's a lot of hope that we will in the next few years.
I hope so. I have to add just one thing about Holland, because I live in Rotterdam, and there's a lot of people here there's many animals here behind closed doors that still a lot of bad things happen here. So I do hope the Dutch government will commit to changing that, but it's shockingly for the country I live in that they still have harming so many animals. And what's more shocking to me is that I am far from anything of being a scientist, and I read some of the data, the papers and everything, and it's unbelievable. There's so much data against this, and people who are scientists still are doing it. That blows my mind almost. There's so much data I've seen on, and since the 70s, like you said, that there's no use, you don't need to use animals. It actually harms people if you use animals because we don't look like them, and still people do it. But I'm happy.
There's more evidence than ever before. It's a huge amount of evidence. It's so convincing. I believe it's a given now. It's just a fact that this is not what we should be doing. And I think alongside that increasing evidence, we're now seeing more desperate defenses from those who are just entrenched in using animals and who want to defend it. They hark back to claims of benefits from animal research going back decades and decades, which, by the way, don't stand up to scientific scrutiny. The claims aren't even scientifically valid. But I think that desperation in those who simply just see the need to use animals and can't see past it. It's becoming more desperate, and it's becoming more desperate because of the volume of evidence against their position. Yeah. And that's only going to increase, not just about how bad animal research is, which is the stick, if you like, the carrot and the stick and the donkey, but more evidence towards the carrot, the attraction, the scientific necessity to move towards this new way of doing things that's human specific, that's high tech, that's amazing and incredible, techniques we could only have dreamed of 10, 15 years ago. And that's where we need to be. And I'm convinced that that's where we will go. The job for those of us who believe in it is just to try and make that shift happen more quickly, because because human beings, millions of human beings who are going to be affected by and suffer from and die from terrible diseases need that shift to happen more quickly.
And on just a more practical side, if there's a scientist working somewhere in a lab and he's against what he's doing, because I think some people, if it's your job, you're forced to basically do work with animals, even if you think it's not good. But what do they do? Do they approach your company, or do they approach your organization, or what do people do that want to change things?
Yeah, I mean, it's if you're working in a lab, even not in a position of power, if you're not the lab head, then to some degree you have to be directed by your superiors in terms of what research you're going to do. But you always have the power to direct that research yourself. And we've all done it. We've all sat in labs and thought, how am I going to answer that question? And flicked through the company catalogs or looked online at how we can answer this question, how we can address this issue. And more scientists are going to see options that are human specific. And the don't need the use of animals, and they will seek to take those options. So so you can direct it yourself, but what we at the newly set up Centre for Contemporary Sciences are trying to do is to set up a whole organization to facilitate that, to get investment to the companies to develop more and better technologies, to really communicate the ability and the power of their technologies to the scientists who will be interested in using them, to educate young and early career scientists that this is what they should be getting into, because it will benefit their career as well as science and as well as humanity. So right across the board, our job, what we're going to try and do is to set up somewhere that anybody can come to find out more about this and find out how they can pursue a career in humane and human relevant science. That's our goal.
Thank you so much for your time, for this interview. I hope to talk to you another time about when you're a little bit further in your organization, and see hopefully by then things have changed. Thanks for your time and good luck with everything.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you for your intelligent questions. Thank you ever so much.
And thank you everyone for watching.
Cheers.